Hola, buenos días a todos.
Hello and good morning, everyone. Greetings to all of our participants and a warm welcome to you. We are now starting the third plenary session of this 10th Conference of the Pan American Network for Drug Regulatory Harmonization, PANDRA, and we wish to welcome representatives of the national regulatory authorities, our colleagues, our participants from PAHO, the WHO, and our partners. Warm greetings to all of you. We are now going to start first by giving you some logistical announcements, and I give the floor to Fernanda and Murilo for this. Thank you, José Luis.
Thank you, José Luis. In this session, we have simultaneous interpretation in Portuguese, in English, in Spanish, in French. Please, can you use your headphones? If you are seeing us in Zoom, you can use the interpretation channel, and for the YouTube channels that are also being transmitted in our online page, you have all the information. If you have any questions during the session, please use the questions and answers Q&A at the bar at the Zoom, or you can raise your hands, and we have somebody who is monitoring the chat, and somebody is going to enter to contact you. Murilo, can you share your screen, please? We're going to do now an exercise, so just so you can have an idea of the characterization of the sample, which follows us throughout the sessions. At the end of the session, we're going to present you the results, all the results. So, if you are in your computer, you can go to www.slido, and you can put the code, enter the code here. The code is 10CPARF. Or, to make life a little bit easier, you can get your cell phones, and you can just simply point your cell phone to the QR code that you see on the screen, and you can start to answer the 4 questions that you have. At the end of the questions, thank you. At the end, we're going to show you live the results, our results today. So now, José Luis, you have the floor.
All right, and thank you very much, Fernanda. Later, we will show you the results of that Slido poll, which will give you an idea of our participants in terms of the number of countries and authorities participating. So, we wish to begin today's session with the remarks of our Assistant Director, Dr. Jarbas Barbosa da Silva, Jr. He is going to share some remarks with us by video. It is a tremendous pleasure and honor to be here with you. Since the last conference in El Salvador, PANDRA clearly showed its strength, but since then, we have suffered the consequences of one of the biggest public health crises of the last 100 years. As always, where our countries and the world faces threats that to the health and well-being of our communities, the challenges of accessing medical and health technologies on an equitable basis, that is, technologies that are safe, effective, and of quality, becomes most important. This crisis calls us to reflect on the many advances that the region has made over the recent decades and the gaps that still need to be overcome. The pandemic offers us a unique opportunity to conduct a critical analysis of the value of the regulatory systems in the post-COVID-19 agenda for health and development. The work of members of PANDRA every day contributes essentially to increasing equitable access to quality, safe, effective health technologies. Collaboration amongst countries through our network and on a bilateral basis is testimony to the efforts and prioritization of strengthening regulatory system that has been taking place in the region in recent decades as a public health necessity. In addition, as a supervisor of the local pharmaceutical industry, national regulatory systems also make significant contributions to the economic development of a country and in generating trust, both within the domestic market, but in also international markets on the quality, safety, and effectiveness of nationally produced products. In 2010, the member states of PAHO adopted Resolution CD50R9, which was a milestone for regulatory systems and formally acknowledged their role in health systems. With this document, the countries gave a strong mandate to PAHO to lead a program to strengthen regulatory capacity throughout the region without regard to previously existing capacity. This is why today this is a key priority amongst the member states of PAHO that aspire to achieve universal health. Following that mandate, PAHO is a pioneer in the world of evaluation and strengthening regulatory capacity that made it possible to not only support countries to improve their own systems, but also to identify the 8 authorities that on a regional basis were performing at a higher level in order to designate them as national regulatory authorities of regional reference. The report on regulatory system strengthening in the Americas, lessons learned from the NRARs, which we launched in 2021, allows us to see how the region has made decisive progress in strengthening its regulatory systems. As I said, when that report was launched, it is thanks to the regulatory strengths and not in spite of them that these countries also have some of the most active pharmaceutical markets in the region. From the report, it is clear that the reference authorities are carrying out most of the regulatory functions by using international practices and standards and have much agreement among them. At the same time, the strongest regulatory authorities in the region acknowledge the value of international harmonization initiatives such as PICS, ICH, IMDRF, and all the regional reference regulatory agencies in the Americas, and to a greater or lesser degree participate in some of these initiatives. The opening of international harmonization fora has made it possible to have increasing adoption of internationally recognized standards, and this facilitates confidence in the products that they export from those markets to other jurisdictions. We have made tremendous progress over the last decade with collaboration between PAHO, countries, industry, and our international and regional collaborators. The 8 national authorities of regional reference are monitoring the pharmaceutical market that serves 82% of the population of the Americas. However, these authorities are only 23% of the total number of authorities in the region. And this makes it clear that there continue to be marked inequalities between our countries. Some countries have growing regulatory capacity, but have not yet achieved the desired level of operation. In light of these challenges, since the adoption of Resolution CD50R9, our member states have redoubled their efforts by creating new agencies in Belize, Ecuador, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Paraguay, and by adopting institutional development plans in 32 countries of the region. The challenges are even greater for small countries and territories where the conditions of the health system and pharmaceutical market require additional efforts to strengthen regulatory capacity. With strong political will and by seeking innovative solutions, the countries of the non-Latin Caribbean are overcoming these structural disadvantages. With the support and technical advice of PAHO and the support of the Gates Foundation, the ministers of health of the Caribbean community were able to implement CRS, which is a regulatory system based on CARFA, the Public Health Agency of the Caribbean. As of today, the Caribbean regulatory system has recommended more than 210 products and continues to expand its reach to countries to support market surveillance and ensure the quality of products circulating in their countries and territories. In addition, countries such as Guyana, Belize, Bahamas, and Turks and Caicos Islands are creating and or strengthening their legal frameworks and regulatory structures within their ministries of health to create synergies with the efforts of CRS. By the same token, another palpable example is the initiative of the Central American countries that have implemented a joint review mechanism to look at dossiers and have joined efforts to work on other regulatory functions by taking advantage of synergies among them. But looking to the future, we must redouble efforts to move forward, to close these gaps, and meet the objective of having each and every resident of our region able to have access to safe, effective, and quality health technologies. It is important to understand that the path towards regulatory strengthening in a country is an arduous one. There are no single models or easy solutions, and capacity is not created with slogans. Regulatory systems are complex by nature. They require a constant supply of human and financial resources and experience with advanced technological expertise, and we must be adapted continuously to the needs of the health system as well as advances in technology and changes in the health system. Strengthening regulatory systems takes time and commitment and must become a state policy in order to be sustainable over time. Domestically, national regulatory authorities must adopt continuous improvement plans and rise to the growing challenges of more complex health technologies and a globalized supply chain. To this end, national regulatory authorities need legal bases and organizational structures that give them a strong mandate to oversee the pharmaceutical markets in their territories. They must hold a position within the national health system that gives them enough technical independence, transparency, risk management, and accountability. These authorities must instill confidence in their citizens and carry out consistent and transparent processes that are based on regulatory science to ensure the quality and safety of products in their markets. With a globalized pharmaceutical market, national authorities cannot fulfill their regulatory and oversight functions by acting in isolation. National regulations must be adjusted to supply chains that may include production plants and principles that come from different continents and territories with different levels of oversight. This requires a search for efficiencies. The authorities must be willing to share information and sometimes share tasks, and in many cases rely on regulatory decisions taken in other jurisdictions of high confidence. This is reliance. The region has been a pioneer in promoting mechanisms for reliance. by adopting a document at the last conference that establishes a series of principles to guide these practices, which serve as the basis for the document on best reliance practices for the regulation of medical products that was adopted by the WHO in 2021. The use of reliance allows us to extend regulatory capacity beyond national borders, making better use of available resources and offering an attractive alternative to create regulatory efficiencies in all regulatory systems without regard to installed capacity. Just as reliance does not mean giving up national regulatory sovereignty, making regulation more flexible to have efficient and timely access to products does not mean that their quality should be diminished. The emergency measures adopted by national authorities since the start of the pandemic have been aimed at adopting essential technologies to respond to the pandemic. Because of the health crisis, authorities have had to quickly implement accelerated processes to allow the entry of technology from other countries or to authorize medicines that had not been previously authorized. The search for regulatory efficiencies and balancing this with protection for access to safe, effective, and quality products needed for the emergency has created tension and placed pressure on our authorities. We must be ready for the next emergency and have clear mechanisms that strengthen access, that protect regulatory authorities from media pressure and political pressure, and above all, that protect our societies from the use of medicines and technologies of doubtful substandard quality. We must safeguard the independency of our agencies by making their decisions more transparent for the population and thus instilling confidence in our citizens. The work over the last decade and the pandemic has taught us many lessons and many best practices. These lessons offer us an opportunity to project and improve our day-to-day activities so that we are better prepared to confront the next health crisis. It is time to use everything that we have learned to build a new regional regulatory policy to be adopted by our member states at the upcoming Pan American Sanitary Conference in 2022. The new regional conference, together with the adoption of the global benchmarking tool since 2019 and the rating system by level of maturity and the necessary specifics aligned with health technology, as well as the introduction of national regulatory authorities listed with the World Health Organization, all require us to renew the mandates from the countries. As we build this new policy, we must also bear in mind the lessons learned since 2010, as well as the pending items in regulating antimicrobials, generic medicines and biosimilars, as well as the adoption of comprehensive surveillance strategies that bring together the capacities of regulatory authorities with the oversight and customs strengths forces in order to fight the entry of falsified medicines into our health systems. Market surveillance is a potential weakness in our systems. Post-market surveillance tends to be less important in the functions assigned to our regulatory authorities. We cannot just assess the efficiency of the system based on how quickly new products are authorized. Quality control systems must conduct appropriate levels of surveillance based on the level of risk involved in new products on the market, and also inform the international community about any adverse events that take place. We must overcome the challenges that have arose around the regulatory response to COVID-19, as well as challenges associated with other technologies such as medical devices, advanced cell therapies, combined technologies, and personalized medical products that require specific oversight to ensure quality and timely access to new treatments. By the same token, the enhanced capacity to produce medicines and essential medical technologies and the revitalization of immunization as a public good demand a new approach to regulatory authorities so that they can be successful, and to have the active participation of various sectors in the work of the NRAs. The future demands regulatory systems that help create ecosystems that foster the production of quality essential technologies that add value to health systems. Such a future will not be possible without the commitment and an active role played by the production sector. We must improve regulation. This is an excellent investment for the country and for industry. Growing trust in the regulatory capacity of the region will make it possible for regional products to enter international markets, thus enhancing access, but also contributing to the economic and social development of our region. Increasing the regulatory capacity and adoption of international standards may positively impact the quality of local products and also generate trust in them and favor their prospects of being exported to other markets. Fostering the production sector will imply new risks of investment in technologies that aim at creating an environment of certainty. So if the industry can enhance its transparency in the markets, this can be done. The current practices in which a country cannot expeditiously confirm the provenance of products, or if the products is a new, different version that was not approved in another market, then this creates mistrust, inequity, and inefficiencies that may affect access and the operations of the industrial sector. If a new policy that strengthens regulatory systems is adopted in 2022, our health authorities will have an opportunity to lay out a new path for regulatory development in the region. This would go beyond public health interests and ensuring the quality, safety, and effectiveness of products that enter our territories. They would also contribute to sustainable systems that serve both health and regional economic development. Such a new policy must review the system of designating national regulatory authorities of reference to adapt this to the current systems of comparative evaluation and the global benchmarking tool. Without a doubt, it is an opportunity to advocate for international recognition of what has been done thus far in our region as we move towards a global situation. In the future, there is a demand for strategies to strengthen these systems and to have harmonization under international standards, and to take advantage of collaborative approaches and look at the practices of reliance. All of these must consider the benefit-risk criteria and foster regional supply chains that benefit access to high-quality products. The role of the production sector and our authorities is critical if we are to overcome a health crisis that demands access to vaccines, pharmaceuticals, and other quality health technologies. Today, regulatory systems are the key for today and for the post-COVID-19 agenda in order to ensure equitable access to safe, effective, quality medicines and help promote production in the region. PAHO renews its commitment to these objectives and thanks the member states for the confidence that you have expressed in us to lead these strategies to strengthen and have regulatory integration over the last decade. We are convinced that the progress over the last decade establishes the pillars on which we can build reliable, transparent, and dynamic systems that are up to the challenge of the post-COVID-19 agenda for health and development. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos entonces las palabras de nuestro director adjunto de la Organización Panamericana de la
We
Salud.
thank our Assistant Director of the Pan American Health Organization for his words, Dr. Charbas Barbosa, who has set the stage for us to focus in this third day of the conference about possibilities, challenges, should there be a new emergency, and the challenges faced by our regulatory agencies. And we now will conclude this morning's presentation. Going back to that topic, I'm certain. Now, let's start with our panel, presided over by the Director of the Food and Medical, Marlon Cole, Food and Drug Department of Guyana. You have the floor, Marlon. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose Luis Castro. Welcome, everyone, and good morning. Today, I take the opportunity and the pleasure of welcoming you to the closing plenary of the 10th Conference of PANDRA, the Drug Regulatory Organization, Harmonization Organization. And today, the topic for discussion that is relevant, even in this time, is as it relates to what do we do as regulators post-COVID. But in fact, what do we do as regulators even now? Because as was said by presenters in the second plenary, we are all in this together, and COVID is here. And so it is fitting that we as regulators decide, contemplate, look at what we would do going forward in response to health technologies that are being introduced in our region and in response to medical products that are being introduced in our region in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Our moderator, Mr. Andres Saiter, from the Global Lead Private Sector at the World Bank, was supposed to be our moderator for this last session, but unfortunately he is unable to grace us with his presence.
Actually, he's here.
Yeah, he's here.
He's there now. Okay.
Yeah.
I was informed that he's running late.
No, I'm not. I had actually a workshop with Georgia, the country Georgia, this morning, which ended like 15 minutes ago. So glad I made it.
Okay, we're happy to have you. And so, Mr. Saito would be our moderator for this session. But before I give the floor to him, I wish to introduce the panelists. Gracing us with his presence this morning is Mr. Manuel Limeres, Director, National Administration of Drug, Food and Drug and Medical Devices Argentina, as we know as ANMAT. We have Mr. Leonardo Sanchez, the Deputy Commissioner of Health Regulatory Agency in Honduras. Patricia Taglieri, the Deputy Director of National Health Surveillance Agency of Brazil, and Visa as we know it. Also with us is Mrs. Daniel Craig from the Regulatory Affairs Lead of the Americas at the Coalition for Innovation on Epidemic Preparedness. And finally, lastly, we have with us as well Mr. Martin Harvey, Head of International Affairs at the European Agency, EMO. Mr. Saiter, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Marlon. I'm very pleased to be here. As mentioned, I just come from another workshop, so that's why I joined a little bit late. But I got like the last 5 minutes of the introductory speech. First you can ask the question, what is this guy doing here from the World Bank? He's not a regulator. No, I'm not a regulator. I've been with the World Bank since 2004. But since 2011, I've been overseeing a work program on medicines regulatory harmonization in Africa, which, as a continent, which of course is far behind Latin America, but it made me, understand a lot more about the challenges that regulators are facing. So I think that is why our PAHO colleagues asked me to chair this panel, also bring maybe in some outside views and some more naive questions that you may not hear, but that might be important for the world, with people who are not specialized in regulation. So in order to get us going, I would maybe ask each of you for a short statement on the experience from the last 1.5 years from the pandemic. What is the one thing you wish you could have done different, or you would like to do different next time when another pandemic hits? Can we just maybe reflect a little bit on that? What is the one thing that should have been different if we knew where we are, what we know today? Let's go down the list as our host has given it. So we start with Argentina, Anmat. Mr. Limeres.
Hola, muchas gracias por la presentación.
Good morning. Thank you very much for that introduction, Andreas, and good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be taking part in this Pan-American Health Organization's conference on PANDRA. Now, as far as the post-COVID agenda, one of the first things I'd like to say is it would be great if next time we meet, we could do so in person. Now, based on the experiences and exchanges that we heard in the first two plenaries and we heard from the regulatory agencies, and we have taken note of some of the opportunities that have presented themselves and lessons learned throughout the pandemic. Now, going to Andreas's question, he says, what would we have done different if we could do something differently? There were some things that we defined internally as a regulatory agency here in Argentina, in which we are certain we would do exactly the same thing. Again, rather than doing something differently, I think we do the same thing. That is, to be servants to our healthcare system, to serve our healthcare system. Each one of our countries represented here today have their own healthcare systems fashioned according to their countries. We have a federal system with provinces, and we have a health ministry in each one of those provinces, in addition to the national health ministry, which is charged with stewardship of the whole system.
Pensamos que si este escenario era como una guerra,
Now, if this were a war, we thought, a war against a small, invisible enemy that has to be attacked in different ways, our role was to work on the logistical aspect of our healthcare system, a healthcare system that's exhausted, very tired after 2 years of battle, needed input. Our role was to ensure the supply and quality of the necessary inputs to wage this war. So what are those critical inputs? We decided that we needed to have a national production, mostly for preventive material, PPE, masks, face masks, and so forth. But then, after that, we swiftly, as the wave advanced, we realized that our priority could not only be preventive, but we had a full-scale medical emergency, so ventilators, medicines, and everything that was necessary for the ICUs. So the reality of the demands of our health care system and of our health ministry that centralized the effort, as well as each provincial health ministry, we had to bring to bear a swift regulatory response that was effective and in line with what our needs were. That's what we did. Now, for that, for example, PAHO issued a document on strengthening regulatory entities and other guiding documents that we abided by. We felt that we were a part of the healthcare system of healthcare workers that came into contact with patients. We were one more party present, working on a common goal. So we had to be present and be as flexible as we could to make more flexible our regulatory process as we move forward, to be able to help our doctors and nurses, biochemists, pharmacists, and so forth, and to have those critical inputs such as diagnostic reagents, other medical products, medications themselves, and then ultimately, when vaccines arrived, implementing them. So that was a joint effort with our health ministry, and some of our industries, such as the textile industry, were converted over to produce equipment such as textiles. Textile industry started making masks. There were 38 different plans last year to produce ventilators. Our Department of Science and Technology worked with industry to come up with new designs for ventilators that could be produced in our country. And because of that, we did not face shortages of any of these necessary products, and our role was to collaborate to ensure that the healthcare system didn't collapse. And we were successful because it did not collapse. Not with the first wave, not with the second wave of COVID-19 did it collapse. That's what we've gone through. Now we find ourselves in a new situation in which
parecería que podríamos empezar a hablar, como
it
dice
would seem,
la charla,
as the title of this talk says, this panel says, about the post-COVID period. But the fact is, it's really hard for us to think about post-COVID when we are still,
después de 20 semanas que estuvo disminuyendo el número de casos en Argentina,
after 20 weeks straight in which we brought down the number of cases
llega el verano dentro de
in Argentina, the last 4 weeks, we see cases rising again now with Omicron in our country. Delta continues to be the predominant variant, and so we're actually gearing up to face a third wave right now, rather than thinking about the post-COVID period. To do so, to think how the regulatory agencies are going to do or operate after we get through COVID. We do think about that every day. We do think about how we're going to act afterwards. We do think, though, how we are going to act as a regulatory agency, what our practices and customs going to be. Countries tend to want to go back to how things were before this pandemic, but you can't really do that. You can't, because if you try to do that, then that short-lived achievement crumbles. And that's where we step in and have to ask what we're going to do differently. So when I think, going a bit beyond the question posed by Andreas, what would we like to have done? Perhaps to have worked with more scientific societies and as a team, to have more time to consult more. That's one of the things we would like to have done and could not do, but we were engaged in this regulatory dialogue at the federal level with the provinces, and we kept ongoing ties with academia, with other national associations, with the Council of Science and Technology, INTI, which is our National Institute of Industrial Technology, other scientific associations, biochemists and doctors, and pharmaceutical professionals and associations. And we took part in all the different international fora that we could with PAHO, WHO, and other regulatory agencies. The Institute of Medical Devices or Products at the international level, just to mention a few. And regarding the new regulatory dynamics, we digitalized thoroughly our system to be able to step up the rate of approval of new medical products, and we use digital platforms now to streamline this process, and with new disciplinary oversight for these new products. So what do we think we have to do moving forward to wrap up that question in this meeting? And I also greet Jose Luis Castro, whom I had not seen for a long time. I just wanted to greet him quickly in the midst of my answer. Well, so what do we need to do? We have to step up pharmacovigilance, oversight. We have a whole pre-market process before a product is sold on the market. We have to be very present, in addition to that, in the market, ensuring traceability of products and medications, including devices, as an essential element within the healthcare system. We continue to work in a network, as we are doing, to strengthen local production, manufacturing of such medical devices. So that is my first stab by way of a response to your question, Andreas.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, I think so. Basically, you gave us a very good overview of a comprehensive response in a country that has like good resources. Maybe we can just cross the border to Brazil and ask Patricia Tagliari from Anvisa. What do you want to add? I mean, certain things will be the same, but I think I know from the news that you had a slightly different challenges also in Brazil than have been in Argentina. Maybe just want to add to Manuel Imere's points and give us your observations, and then we move on to Central America.
Ok, obrigada, Andrés.
Thank you, Andres. It's a pleasure to be here with you, to see again so many friends and be here at the PAR conference. With this matter, what would you like? What would you do different? How could we act and opted for a different path if we had this information, this knowledge beforehand? In our case, and of course, my lines are almost the same as Mr. Limeres, but Anvisa, I think it has acted well in the pandemic. We provided good reports, and we have done things that were feasible. But we have had some knowledge regarding communication. Of course, Anvisa develops perennial communication. But in terms of during the pandemics, if we had started to communicate better and more with the actors, in addition to the other agencies, I think it would be something positive to so the population could rely on us more. So it was a curve of knowledge that was a great curve of knowledge. In the first months, we took some time to learn that, but we, not only our communication agency worked very well, but all the players in the decision-making process, they were very aware to what communications do, to what communicate in the fastest way so the transparency could happen, and all the information that were needed were passed on to the players, and so they could take their decisions and they could act promptly. So I would highlight this experience that was very important to us. Thank you, Andres.
Thank you very much, Patricia. So, Leonardo, Honduras, as a Central American country, you don't have the same resources that Brazil and Argentina have, no? But I know there's also a collaboration between the neighbors. Give us a little bit an impression of what kept you awake at night during the pandemic, and what are you taking out of it?
Muchas gracias, Andrea, y un saludo a todos los panelistas. Un gusto estar aquí y compartir con ustedes.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and I greet everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be with you in this third plenary. I'm very happy to be taking part and to have been able to watch the prior sessions, which were quite interesting. Now, what kept me up at night during the pandemic? To seek out these mechanisms of collaboration, joint collaboration, which with through an initiative between PAHO and Central American countries. It's important for us to have a harmonized regulatory system, which we do, but then we go to the different countries and they all seem to be acting differently, even though we have this harmonized system. Now, there are some aspects about our neighboring countries' regulatory agencies that we're not so familiar with. This is one more step of regulation in which we avail ourselves of the resources other countries have available to them, medicines and other items we were able to share. Now, we do play a very important role during the pandemic, our regulatory agencies, because just as given the fact that our systems were set up to operate in person, to have a presence, we had to do it digitally because, of course, the countries were shut down, the offices were shut down, and we had to do that quick transfer to the digital form of interacting. Now, this makes it possible for countries to interact, for us to instill trust in each one of the Central American regulatory agencies. We came to understand and know how each one of our counterpart agencies operate and what the different mechanisms each one has. These mechanisms helped us to establish evaluation procedures while each one of our countries has its own administrative procedures that they have to follow to reach the issuance of authorization registry. We're able to abbreviate those necessary times. And with the Reliance system, then what is approved in one country, it then becomes something that allows access to medicines in other countries.
Do you think is this Reliance system working well? Just as a follow-up question.
Claro que sí,
Of course it is. Yes, it's a system that, without a doubt, helps us a lot. Those countries that have scarce resources, low populations, that really favors access. Central American legislature establishes Reliance intrinsically to say that we're only going to do we share, that is, the fact that we don't have to re-register something that's already been registered in another country. Now, that's an intrinsic aspect of our legislation. So what the only thing that we need to strengthen our evaluation systems, unify and harmonize our criteria for us to do the correct evaluation ourselves and to have access thereby to technologies.
I'm asking because, as I mentioned, from the interest on the African continent with the emerging African Medicines Agency, there will be need for actually establishing a similar system of reliance where you have a few stronger agencies and many very weak ones. So we can then certainly take some learnings from Latin America. Let me jump over to Europe now. So I see Danielle from CEPI, and maybe you can speak a little bit on the question, the Geneva, Washington, we talk a lot about more manufacturing capacity for future pandemics so that vaccines can reach populations in the countries faster that are not necessarily the first customers for the big multinational companies. What can the regulators do? How is the collaboration between an organization like CEPI that has access to the looking at the R&D part and the regulators, and do you have any suggestions or wishes that you want to put here to your colleagues in the regulatory functions? Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Andres, and thank you to the organizers for inviting us to participate. I think that is a great question. As CEPI, we aren't a regulator, we aren't a manufacturer, we're a global nonprofit organization, and we find partnerships between these public and private entities to enhance epidemic preparedness. And so I think one of the big successes we've had is participating in the establishment of the COVAX Regulatory Advisory Group and Committee, where we were able to bring questions from those early stage developers and often inexperienced developers. We weren't always dealing with big pharma who have robust systems, and we were able to bring their concerns to a wide group of regulators and have open and transparent discussions on what were the issues they were facing, be it capacity in a specific region or a lack of technical expertise or flexibility. Obviously, we were all developing that technical understanding of COVID on the fly and quickly. And so to be able to have those open dialogues between the regulators and the developers across programs was very, very beneficial. And I hope that that is something that continues moving forward, because I mean, a hallmark of that preparedness is to think beyond where are we today and have the systems in place for that global arena. What are the global epidemiological things that we are seeing happening? And are we sharing that information within our countries and within the world? I think the other point that several others have touched on is that idea of harmonization. We have lots of organizations who put forward these international standards, and how do we come closer to a day-to-day understanding and interpretation so that we're reducing the burden on local regulators to interpret and have different perspectives that then really make things complicated from a manufacturer perspective. If you are trying to establish yourself as a new manufacturer and you have Europe looking for one set of standards and you have your local Latin American country looking for a different set, it's very difficult to determine who you want to operate within. And really, I think what's going to be important moving forward is to make that interaction as local as possible as the first stop in the program. So, continuing to open both across regulators, but also between the individual regulators and the manufacturers and developers in their region, keep those dialogues open. What may seem like a really non-pressing development program at the moment may turn out to be the next pandemic. And so being ahead of that and recognizing that really some of the flexibility and innovations that were enacted during COVID will benefit us in the long term to keep that going and make that the new status quo, rather than returning to some of the more regimented here. I'm based in the US, and there are all sorts of regimented systems and communication pathways. And I think having that flexibility to be more intimate of a relationship between the regulators and the developers throughout the life cycle of a program will really help us be prepared more quickly the next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just a quick check with the organizers. We have time for this discussion and Q&A until 10:45. Is this correct? You can just send me a quick message or speak up if I'm...
Yes. Hi, Andres. Yes, that's correct.
That's correct. So we have 45 more minutes. Okay. Martin, can you maybe, from the EMA's perspective, add to what Danielle just said? For me, the question is a little bit, yes, we have talked about this global collaboration between regulators many years back. I remember I was once invited actually by a conference hosted by Anvisa in Manaus, where all the heads of major regulatory agencies came together. And, it was clear that, there is so much complexity, so much work that even the big ones need to collaborate.
Yep.
Has the pandemic accelerated this trend or shown new difficulties? How are you more optimistic now, or you say, oh, it's a big mess and we need to work much harder? Martin, over to you.
Well, so again, with the European hat, I'm very conscious that I'm participating. I'm a guest in this in the BAHO conference. So thank you. Can I just, before I answer that, Andres, because I just want to pick up a couple of things. Listening to the colleagues talk about what would they have done differently with the surprise, I want to say this is not the first pandemic we've faced. And have we learned the lessons from H1N1, from MERS, and from SARS and the others? And every time it comes, and this is a little bit what Danielle was getting at, every time it comes, it takes us by surprise. We've never had a pandemic before. How are we going to respond? So we do need to make sure that we are learning the lessons and responding for the future. I would also like to pick up on something you said, Andreas, about stronger and weaker agencies. I think it's a little invidious, particularly bear in mind what Jarba said earlier on about the CD50 R9 resolution. I don't think it's useful or even fair to talk about weak agencies. I think we need to get away from the idea of every agency needing to be ML4 or ML3 in a region. It's not necessary. And I think there's the value to recognize that some agencies will be full service, bells and whistles, incredible ML4 authorities. And other countries won't necessarily need that. They may actually be able to fulfill their public health obligations to their citizens and in their political system by operating at a particular standard. So the European experience is we have a number of big agencies who perform everything. And we have a number of EU agencies, European national agencies, that specialize either by therapeutic area or by a technology perspective, like advanced therapies or whatever. We have this mix. And I think in any region, if you're working together, think about Jarvis's vision of this, of the Americas and the network, any regional response will need this mix. So we don't need every agency in the Americas to be ML4. It's not necessarily useful. It's not necessarily achievable. So just, we need to strike that right mix. What else? So the meeting you're talking about, Andreas, in Manaus, which I should have been at, but I wasn't able to go, was the foundation of a coalition called the International Coalition of Medicine Regulatory Authorities. And in fact, we have ANMAT and Visa, and also the counterparts from Chile are members of ICMRA. I'm very pleased to say that the EMA, the head of the EMA, is currently the chair of ICMRA, and I have the very interesting task of being the secretariat of this coalition. So, coming back to the original question, is what should we have done, or what lessons, what would I like to have done earlier on, is to make sure we have this global cooperation in place from the beginning, and the global response has actually been very useful. Daniela was talking about the different standards, the different requirements. And we realized probably 6 or 7 months ago, it was important that we were, for example, responding correctly in terms of the boosters. We all had a common response in terms of how the requirements for developing boosters, the requirements for developing variants, the requirements so that we were having a global regulatory response. In fact, I'm not just saying this because Patricia's on the call, and Visa hosted the recent summit of ICMRA regulators. In fact, Dr. Limeres was also part of the summit and the plenary. We will, in January, for example, try to come together for a global regulatory response, or at least a global position on the Omicron variant, and where we want to go as a coalition of regulators to respond for that. That will help Daniela's members. That will help the regulators. It will help industry, and it'll help the political response as well, because we are working together in a single direction for everybody. So we need to have global public health requires a global approach for regulators. And if you're asking me what real lesson I really would have wanted before the pandemic, is to learn how to double mute myself in a Zoom call, because that number of times when I've not been able to speak and I've been talking and no one's heard a single thing I've said. So the double mute function on Zoom and Teams, that's the one thing I would change if I possibly could do.
Aren't we all in this predicament? Thank you. So that's a positive message. So I think the meeting in Manaus was good for something, and we have actually, as regulators, I can say we, I'm not a regulator. You have shown that this partnership actually delivers real benefits. No? So this is a good thing. We have an interesting comment in the chat from Mexico about the communication with the population. Maybe we can move over to that, because that is an important topic that I think, see in various countries and in very different forms. Just as a background, World Bank is actually financing vaccination campaigns in many different countries on all continents. And we find that whereas some countries are very eager to absorb and vaccinate their population, in other countries there is a whole lot of resistance and a whole lot of issues, and the numbers are very low, even neighboring countries. So perceptions and communication play an important role. To what extent are regulators in a good position there, or what do you have any messages to the politicians or suggestions to strengthen resources in this area? Maybe, I don't know, do we want to go back? Manuel, do you want to come in maybe from UNMAT? And please, I just want to say also, try to keep the interventions to 2 to 3 minutes so that we have a bit dynamic discussion. No? Thank you. Manuel, over to you.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Andreas.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Yes, the issue of communication is central. It seems to me in a pandemic, what is happening is that communications are decentralized in our Ministry of Health. As a regulatory agency, we produce information, and the ministry works with the provincial ministries of health to communicate that message. We know what kind of problems that creates in terms of acceptance by people who have vaccine reluctance. With their vaccine reluctance, but they have a big need to go out and meet up with their friends. And they handle this pandemic in a different way. And this goes hand in hand with complicated psychological situations for all of us. I also think in terms of the message that we communicate from the regulatory authorities to politicians, at least what I personally believe is that access to vaccines needs to be more equitable. It's been concentrated in certain parts of the world. Fortunately, Argentina is one of the countries that was able to get vaccines from the beginning, regardless of where they come from. But we've had vaccine from the beginning. But not all countries have had access to vaccines and the possibility of rolling out big vaccination plans. We believe that here in Argentina, with 100 million vaccines that came in since April 23rd of last year, till the end of the month, 100 million vaccines for a certain population. We still have 7 million people who have not yet been vaccinated for some reason or another. This is a matter of domestic distribution and politicians convincing people to get vaccinated. But the distribution of vaccines around the world is not equitable. So 100 million vaccines in a population of 40 million, and still people are not vaccinated. 45 million.
Right. Leonardo, maybe how is this in Central America? I mean, I have to say it's kind of unfair to ask regulators to be the ones that communicate to the general population. No, you are interacting with experts, and you have been selected to be experts. You are not politicians that talk to the people in the street, no? So, but let me see how is the situation in Honduras and neighboring countries.
Sí, de igual manera que
yes, as in Argentina, communication comes through the Ministry of Health of Honduras. However, we had an important role to play because we don't leave them alone. At certain points, we had to help them communicate this message. First of all, to calm people down, because people were very anxious and impatient. Information was coming out, and this gave rise to new, quote unquote, knowledge in the population. Everyone was an immunologist, an epidemiologist, a vaccineologist, to say, so to speak. And we try to debunk some of the myths. And also, I have to tell you, we try to untangle or decode the technical language to transfer it to the population. This is really a very complex task, and if you don't use the proper wording, it can lead to a lot of disinformation. In Central America, we try to have the same message. All of our authorities were in continuous contact with messages, video calls, personal communication regarding what new trends we were seeing and how the vaccines were coming in. I agree with Argentina. While we still have not yet received vaccine doses for 100% of the population, we have received enough to vaccinate 70% of the population. And we see that within our population, we just have 30% of people who do not want to get vaccinated. And this, again, is a message that the political parties need to work on to instill trust and to be aware of the new dawn in our region if we make use of these tools so that we can reopen our economies and have new opportunities for employment, et cetera. Thank you.
Yes, it's interesting. You say 30% don't want to be vaccinated. That seems to be kind of a number that you find in many countries. No, I live in the United States. I don't have to tell you. Not an easy topic. Yeah. I heard it in my family. My daughter over the phone talking to an uncle who doesn't want to be vaccinated and trying to convince him. So it's not easy. And I mean, I'm German by upbringing, so I've. In the beginning of the pandemic, I looked at the Robert Koch Institute in Berlin and their communication. No? And, Martin, you're probably interacting with them, but I found this very good. Still, Germany is not at the forefront of countries in Europe in terms of the vaccination rates. No? So it's, I think this is something that all of us who, come from an intellectual, science, medical, more rational background is hard for us to grasp. No? Patricia, any observations from your side? In Brazil also you have, not everybody is in favor of vaccinating and taking the pandemic serious. How was that? Was there any pressure on the on Anvisa, or how have you navigated this situation?
Obrigada pela pergunta. Thank you for your question. It's a matter that is very interesting. It's a privilege to be working at Anvisa in this moment where we have been so requested to contribute towards the pandemic. So in relation to the communication and pressures and eventual doubts that the population would have regarding vaccination, some data is very interesting. In Brazil, we have the immunization program, and the Ministry of Health has a wonderful experience in regards to logistics and to reach an adoption of politics for vaccination. So we have a structure that is already established in the country. It's very strong one. So in general, the reluctance to get vaccinated, it's not so big in the population. But regarding COVID, it was a little bit different. I think because of the politics and the pressures of politics, and also because they were very anxious to overcome this pandemics and to do the best that they could to overcome this. So in the beginning of the year, some countries, when they started to have these vaccines approved, the pressure was really big. So in Brazil, we had some vaccines that were being developed and ready to be applied, but there were some stages that were missing, and even regulation ones from Anvisa. So in regarding to communication, something that was made by Anvisa's directorship as a strategy that was very positive and that has contributed to solve, to calm part of the society, part of the population, that had some questions about if they would get vaccinated or not. They had a meeting, a public one. That was transmitted live on the internet, so that the technicians that evaluated the process for the vaccination that were available at the moment, they could go public and they could present in a very concrete way and translating these technical issues that are very complex. The specialists, they were able to translate this to the population. So I think there was a two-hour live, and we had a big participation from the population that could understand what were the aspects that were evaluated to consider that these vaccines were in fact safe for the population. This was really important. And for me, this was something that I share with my colleagues. It was the way that Anvisa could act better, not in relation just to buying the vaccines, but to make this reality, this complex reality, easier for the population, so that the citizens could feel better and they could defend, they could call their families and say, yes, let's get vaccinated. The vaccines are safe. We have all the information. They are safe, trusted by Anvisa. They're safe. So it's a lesson for us in terms of communication to have this public meeting to translate for the common citizen the advantages, the safety of the vaccines. So I think this was really important to overcome some difficulties that the citizen had in terms of making this decision.
Thank you. That's interesting. That's good. Yeah, it's fascinating to watch around the world how all these various issues intersect. So I just want to quickly also ask our moderators in the background whether there's any questions in the chat or the Q&A directed to any of the panelists that I might not have seen before I go on with asking another question here. So we want to also have the chance for other participants. I've seen we have over 200, almost 250 people on the call.
Andreas, could I pick up? I mean, it's slightly picking up from the question in the Q&A chat from the Nicaraguan colleague.
Thank you.
And something you said earlier on about the role of regulators. I actually do strongly believe regulators have a role to contribute to the communications. And Patricia just gave a very eloquent example of what Anvisa has done, and I'm sure the same thing we've seen in many other regulators across the Americas. We may not, as regulators, be taking the decisions on which vaccines are going to whom. We may not be taking the decisions. There are national immunization committees and that sort of thing. But I think it is our responsibility to put out into the public domain the rationale, the reasons why we approved a particular product. So we put the data, we put the rationale out there, and it is then for the decision makers to then also be equally as transparent. So we as regulators, these are the data, we evaluated them, this is our conclusion, and then it's you, the public health authorities, you, the immunization committees, that take the decision. And this avoids the situation where decision takers are perhaps hiding behind the regulator. It's about making sure that the colleagues in Nicaragua, in Brazil, in Honduras, in Argentina, everywhere, they can trust. They can trust their local regulator because they know the data are there and they have put their assessment out in the public domain. I also think it's not just important enough just to have this one-way dialogue. And I'm not suggesting, Patricia, this is what Anvisa did, because I know what he did and it was rather clever. But it's not just a question of doing a video broadcast from our experts telling you what we did. It's also about responding to what's happening. So it's about responding to the concerns on social media. And that was one of the questions from the Nicaraguan person, listening to what people are saying and being proactive. So being proactive about pregnancy. Pregnant women will catch COVID, and women will become pregnant. So be on the front foot. Think about how we respond to that. Respond to all the social media rubbish about menstrual cycle, about fertility, and that sort of thing. Be proactive in communicating the data. What we know, what we don't know, and what we're doing about it. And I think, Leonardo, you made a comment about different agencies saying different things. I think that we also learned that here in Europe, and we made sure that we were coordinating the messaging of all the national authorities. So we were having regular coordination. These were the positions, these were the lines to take. We did a similar thing with the European Centre for Disease Control. So the CDC and the public health authorities, EMA, and the national medicines authorities were absolutely aligned on all the messaging. And that's really important. Don't let any difference happen. So I think that's really important, that we make sure you get that coordination, get that cooperation, get that stakeholder engagement, answer their questions, not just say what you want to say.
Mm-hmm. Over. Yeah, it's an interesting discussion. I think basically what I'm taking from it is that absolutely, I fully agree. Regulators have a role in communication. They need to be empowered in the society to play that role well, and they need to have the skill to translate it into a language that can be understood, and that is a skill that can be trained. No? And I mean, one aspect that I always bring up in communication of these issues is dilemma sharing. So you're making decisions where you're weighing trade-offs. No? Nothing is 100% clear in biology. And I think sometimes it's also useful to actually share this dilemma and compare the different risk levels and say, this is what we know here and this is what we know there. Then you can make your choices, no? Because the spontaneous human perception of risk is very biased, as we know. Yeah? It's not a rational one, and that is often that creates these weird situations where people are making choices that actually are non-rational when you look at them from a scientific case. No? So it's very interesting, and that's definitely, I think, an area where I think regulators can learn from each other and can strengthen their skills. No? Martin, I wanted to come back to the weak regulatory agencies. So I fully agree with you on that one, because that's also important for the work we're doing on the African continent, as you are also involved, I know. No? I think it's good to have a discussion at the regional level, and you obviously have done that in Latin America, as to what are the different roles and the different capacities and so on. It hasn't happened in other continents yet. And that's where you decide there might be some agencies really only the focus is on, the national enforcement of the basics for, drug safety, market surveillance, and so on. And there might be others that are at a level that they can evaluate a submission of a new biologic treatment, but many, many others will not be at that point. So the division of labor, that goes hand in hand with the trust into reliance on each other. And so I think your continent is a bit like a role model for other continents. So I just want to close this up. So that's the way I see it. I want to switch to another question that goes into the post-COVID area. And this is like, we are often coming across in countries that certain medicines are hard to get on the market. They are not necessarily new, yeah, but they are not super profitable. The market is small, and the profit margin is relatively limited. So manufacturers are not so interested in that. Is there anything you can do as regulators in order to help the procurement agencies in your countries? And maybe let's start with Patricia at this point.
Thank you, Andreas. This matter of lacking of drugs, it's complex, and it depends on many scenarios. And talking about specifically here in Brazil, something that we live, a reality, is that some drugs are unavailable, not because the market isn't interested on them. For example, sometimes there are some pharmaceuticals, active pharmaceuticals, some inputs that are imported. So sometimes they are here. We have local regulators that accept them, but we don't have them for many reasons. So in this scenario, we have some actions that regulators can do, but it's still limited. So agility in the process of evaluation, alternatives, creating mechanisms that are so we can evaluate this process. So this process can happen faster, but we have other issues that impact as well. For example, Brazil, we have some price regulation on the drugs. This is not done by us. It is done by a set of ministries. But of course, there is a lack of evaluation, and maybe this can cause an interest to make these drugs and even import these drugs. So there would be a need of importing outside of the regulatory mark, which is not ideal. So these situations, they are outside of our regulators. So aside from these specific matters, so what I observe is to face these lack of medicaments is that we have mechanisms working that permit to make these regulations available faster when there are other players involved. For example, if there is not a medicament that's registered in Brazil due to many factors, but we have some drugs that are registered, that are registered in other regulators, that we could make this decision. Maybe we could import this drug or not, although it is not registered in Brazil, but it's important to have access to this information because we can see if in another country there is the registration for this medicament, if it was evaluated, if it is equivalent to what we have here. So to have access to this information and even to have reliance mechanisms that are already established, so they can solve an emergency situation, for example. In fact, we could go to this information of partners to have evaluated these products that are not registered in Brazil. So Anvisa could come to recommend or exceptionally approve these drugs. And there is a measure that is very simple that helps everyone, all the regulators in general, that although we don't have established formally a reliance mechanism or a more automatic operational strategy, it is for every regulator to have the effort to make their decisions public, all the evaluations public, so we could have access to these informations faster without putting on the regulators this weight that each time is necessary for us to manually extract this information, and we can share this information with other regulators. So if we have more transparency, if we could be more transparent and more proactive, we could share this information in our public domain, and it would help the regulators in this process of decision making.
Yeah, thank you. Any of the other colleagues want to add to this? I think what you said is right. This is not a problem only for the regulator, although you play a piece on it. Yeah, Manuel. Yes, please. Go ahead, Manuel Jiménez.
Bueno.
Yeah.
Gracias. Muchas gracias, Andrea.
Thank you.
Exactamente como decía la colega de Anvisa.
Just as our colleague from Anvisa said, this is something we addressed from the outset, working within the logistics of a system that was going to battle. That's how we saw this problem, and we did work with our procurement agency shoulder to shoulder. And so that it's important for there to be this interrelationship between regulatory agencies of all of our countries. And we have held meetings and consultations about products and how the private sector in countries can facilitate in quick access of a product into the market. Now, in Argentina, we do have a large private sector that produces medications, as well as state producers, and their performance has been outstanding.
É o seguinte, caiu a internet aqui na minha rua e agora eu acabei conseguir ligar de novo.
No sé.
But, so I'm just looking at the questions in the Q&A. Maybe also you as panelists, if you can directly answer these questions, feel free to do that. Some of it is it's just comments on reliance. And okay, let me get back to you, panel, with like maybe a final round of questions, asking you to look at the future going forward and the evolving pharmaceutical markets worldwide, with more globalization, with interesting new partnerships. Thinking of what has happened also around the vaccines with CEPI and others who are not for profit but very active in the in the research and development space, and basically creating platforms where things can happen that would not necessarily happen when driven only by profit motives. So maybe if I can ask you to think a little bit about 5 years down the road, what do you think has changed in 5 years from today, and how does it impact access to modern healthcare, and also what economic impact and changes do you see, for example, in terms of the distribution of manufacturing capacity around the globe? And maybe let's start with Danielle. You haven't spoken in a while, Danielle. Your Geneva perspective. No, CEPI is in Norway, no?
Yes, Norway.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So, I think when I think of what happened with COVID, it shows us that when appropriate mechanisms exist to share data, to rely on one another, we can respond quickly to these public health events and reduce the impact that they have on the livelihood and economies of our countries. I think it's important for us to recognize, as we take that 5-year look, that strengthening doesn't always mean implementing new rules or requirements, but making sure that what regulations and supporting documents and guidelines and training materials we have in place continue to support the needs of the world today. I thought that it was a really important discussion we were having around ensuring that the public understands what do regulators do and what responsibilities do developers have, and really taking a bit of a public relations approach and understanding that that public relations aspect is important for regulators and regulatory systems, so that we build that trust with the public, the population who aren't scientifically minded and are just worried about how do I get back to my regular life and all of the things that I want to be doing that this pandemic or epidemic or whatever the new event is keeping me from doing. And having that trust built in because they understand what are the policies in place, how are things being reviewed, and what collaboration is happening, that I can know that a product made in Brazil is going to be safe for me in my country. So I think that's definitely something that we'll need to continue to think about, and not just think about what communications need to happen between manufacturers and regulators and politicians, but the public really is, in our social media world, a very key partner in all of that discussion. I think we'll continue to see enhancing flexibilities in how we share our data between manufacturers, developers, and regulators. Reliance is not just a paperwork exercise. It's trust building amongst each other and sharing information and finding new ways to do that. Things like master files, where a manufacturer may not need to submit the same information across multiple jurisdictions, or we're not relying on a regulatory body from a developer side to do that sharing on our behalf. That, finding new technology platforms to make that sharing easier for everyone. I think I'll leave it there.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. That was good. It was very comprehensive. Martin, do you have maybe a 1-minute statement? We have about 5 minutes left for our discussion on this topic.
So I think Danielle is absolutely right. We need to create the reliance is not going to work if we start the day of the pandemic. We need to build the reliance networks today so that we trust ourselves. And I say that from the experience of the European Medicines Agency, where it took years for our scientific committees, the members, to actually begin to trust each other. That not each member state had to redo the scientific assessment. It took them years to actually get to a situation where they could rely on the rapporteur and a co-rapporteur to do the work, and they were content in the work-sharing, collaborative reliance system that we have to work in that way. It takes years. And I come back to what Jarba said at the beginning in terms of the way we're going forward with the CD50R9 and whatever will follow next year at the summit, in next year's conference. We need to begin now on building the reliance networks to trust. It's not as an individual, I don't trust. Trust is interpersonal. I trust Manuel Jimenez because I have been in meetings with him. I trust Patricia because I know Patricia. I trust Andreas because I've been in meetings and I've met Andreas and we've spoken in the past. We need to have that in person. And Manuel made the comment about the next meeting being in person. I totally agree, by the way. Trust is done at a personal level. It's not an institutional trust. It's a personal thing. Begin the process now. Manufacturing. I'm always slightly reticent when we charge into this whole story about promoting local manufacture. Understand what is the problem we are solving for. Understand, is the product, the manufacturing you're doing, is it going to be able to compete on price? Is it going to be able to compete on quality? We know quality has a price. WHO has been saying this for years. Quality has a price. So understand what it is you're trying to do. And if it's because you want local manufacturing, multiple sources, whatever, then yes, that's what you try. Just understand what you're doing, and you're not creating a situation where you're having many manufacturers and the risk of substandard and falsified products. Understand and be careful where you're going. We have the same discussion going on in Africa, where many countries want to go headfirst into manufacturing African medicines produced by Africans in Africa. It's a wonderful slogan, but it ain't going to work. Transparency. Really work hard on transparency. Put the information out there. Be open. Respond. And engage with stakeholders. I was struck listening at the beginning of the panel, Andres, when you asked Manuel, Leonardo, and Patricia to respond. All three of them spoke about communication and stakeholder engagement. Do it now. Keep doing it. Listen to industry. Engage with industry. Get them to understand what is their issue. What is the solution to get them, come back to your question, how can we create a situation where they will apply for marketing authorization in your country? Engage with them and find out. Engage with patients. Engage with healthcare professionals. You need to have the trust. So the next pandemic, you know that the midwives are going to listen to you. So when the midwife is opposite a pregnant woman, that the midwife will say, "Oh yes, Anvisa has said this, or Anmat has said this, or ARSA has said this. I've worked in years. I trust them. Get that vaccine." So engage and keep engaging. Don't engage because there's a crisis. Again, it comes back to trust. Safety monitoring. We haven't spoken a lot about safety monitoring and safety and pharmacovigilance. We're pushing the idea of the vaccines and the therapeutics now. Are they safe? Do we know that? How do we know that? What are the mechanisms? So we need to make sure that we create regional networks to make sure that we are properly monitoring the safety of medicines, and we're getting that information together. And the last point then is about lessons learned. We need to do a comprehensive lessons learned exercise individually, each agency at your region and globally. And there will be some flexibilities we've introduced, which we want to keep as part of our normal business. Some flexibilities we want to keep for the next pandemic. And there's some flexibilities we've introduced, which actually we say, we're not going to do that again. And whatever decision we make has to be sustainable. They come back to the point about the capacity of agencies. We need to make sure the flexibilities we have can be sustainable. We can keep doing it, and we can build the robust agencies we have that are transparent, reliable, and credible. Otherwise, we're going to fall over ourselves. It was longer than 30 seconds, but I hope that was useful.
Thank you. Thank you. Leonardo, last word for you. We are at time, but you have your hands up, and I think you speaking from the continent, the last word before we head back to Marlon.
Gracias, Andrea. Sí, y Martin resumió muy bien todo lo que estábamos hablando.
I think Martin summed up things quite well, everything we've been talking about in this panel, without a doubt. To create, for Africa to be creating each country their own medicines, that's a pipe dream. Same thing here in the Americas. Unfortunately, in our countries, when in the 50s, 60s, when there was the pharmaceutical boom in the Americas, the industries set up shop, and there was not transfer of technology and knowledge, and so that has made it very difficult for us. And as Patricia was also saying, in 95% of the medicines, or raw materials rather, are imported. The same thing can be said in Honduras, 100% imported. There is no local production, but unlike other countries in which they do have those raw materials and inputs, but even if we wanted to favor this, bringing in raw materials from the other side of the continent makes it very costly, and the investment isn't attractive for investors. But to create mechanisms, joint mechanisms, where you're opening up to larger markets, then that can be a good initiative. And I was asking, and Andreas was asking, how do we see the next 5 years? Well, Rafael from Cuba, who passed away, from the first agency, you put down that first cornerstone and you build on that. And so 5 years down the road, that common America's agency, regulatory agency, will perhaps be stood up. That would be very helpful.
I thank you all very much. That was a fascinating discussion. I learned a lot. It was nice to meet you in virtual. As I said before, let's hope that next one is in person, be it Manaus or elsewhere. And I hand back to Marlon. My job is done here as host for this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas, for a job well done. And to all the panelists, when I heard Dr. Barbosa mention about Regulation C-1050R9, in my imagination, it's as if Dr. Barbosa was looking within our agency, our regulatory agency in Guyana. And because some of the things that he spoke about were those things that we work towards over time. And Andreas, we have what you call the Caribbean regulatory system for small and developing state in the Caribbean. I think 15 of us. We started in 2014 to develop an harmonized approach. And I believe it was completed in 2018. And there in 2020 comes the pandemic, in which we were helplessly reliant on vaccines, registration and approval, and medical devices as well. But to take away Mr. Harvey's point, not all of us has to be at level ML4 with harmonizational reliance. And that is very, very key for us going forward. I think political decisions, as was mentioned, must be collective and bipartisan and must be in the interest of the public. But the role of regulators in communication, as was discussed by this panel, I believe is important. And as Martin has said as well, trust in the regulators. Then how to get difficult products to market, particularly in small states. Could regulators help in this practice? That jumped out at me, Andreas. But if manufacturers are to scale up during the pandemic or after the pandemic, the public must know why. And the public must also know what are the regulators' role in the scaling up activity. And as Martin said as well beautifully, that yes, the vaccines are here now. We haven't spoken a lot about safety during the panel, but safety and pharmacovigilance, capacity building in the region for us is very, very important. Capacity building must be robust throughout, but must be sustainable. So thank you very much, Andreas, and the panel for allowing us to be exposed to such deep discussions that are akin to us as regulators being able and capable to be responsive to this current pandemic and for future pandemic. I'd like to thank Dr. Barbosa as well for his opening remarks as a keynote speaker. At this point in time, I'd like to allow us to listen to Dr. Mary-Luz Valdez. She's the Deputy Director of the Pan-American Health Organization. And Dr. Valdez will now address us with her closing remarks for this very dynamic and important session. Over to you, Dr. Valdez.
Thank you, Dr. Cole. I really appreciate it. And it's a particular pleasure for me to see a number of colleagues I haven't seen in a very long time. So it's great to see your faces and hear your voices. I want to begin by thanking our audience. As Andres said, we had more than 250, and that's in this session. It excludes the numbers that we may have seen in YouTube. And I think it's a reflection of what you all have been talking about, which is the critical role that regulators play in the safety, quality, and efficacy of products. Where can someone in the public place their trust? So regulatory authorities and issues have been central to the delivery and access to much needed vaccines and supplies during this COVID-19 pandemic. And these will remain critical as countries, particular countries in our region, but elsewhere, grapple with the recovery and rebuilding efforts, including, as Dr. Barbosa explained in his remarks, expanding manufacturing capacity in the region of the Americas. Let me thank the members of this third panel for addressing what is a range of important and key concepts, as these will help PAHO update its regional cooperation strategy. It's been said, but collaboration among regulatory agencies with non-governmental actors can help to build new models of collective engagement that the pandemic has already accelerated or unearthed. Preparedness for technology and innovation developments will require that regulators update and renew approaches with a range of sectors and stakeholders at country level. Information between regulators and the pharmaceutical industry has increased, and a number of our panels reiterated this. But more can be done to strengthen transparency and make available non-confidential reports and evidence. For example, PAHO and its member states will explore how to exchange reports on adverse reactions and dissemination of risk management plans much more routinely. The pandemic has also fostered reliance to simplify the regulatory pathway to access without sacrificing the safety, efficacy, and quality of our medical products. And the panel shared some interesting ideas to better enable, with clear criteria, the operationalizing of reliance actions beyond the approval processes and along a product's life cycle. PAHO has engaged with governments, with development banks, UN agencies, regulators, and others on the impacts of the economic, public health, and social well-being of our populations due to the pandemic, including the impacts that the pandemic has had on our regulatory systems. COVID provides us both challenges and opportunities. I'll end with highlighting some opportunities which require the collaboration among regulators and its stakeholders. And that is advancing the regulatory agenda and framing how national authorities may strengthen regulatory coherence and reliance, how they can help to strengthen the integrity of supply chains, and how can we work better together to strengthen communication and information sharing. As Martin said, it begins and ends with trust, and trust starts one-on-one. Let me say how, on behalf of all of us at PAHO, we look forward to working with the regulators in the region and in our region of the Americas. And again, my thanks to our panelists for joining us today and taking time out of their very busy schedules to share with us their expertise and experience. So Dr. Cole, back over to you, and thank you again for allowing me to join.
Thank you very much, Dr. Valdez, for reminding us about the regulatory agenda that is to be advanced, and for us to indeed think about new models of collective engagement. Yes, there's more to be done on transparency, but while we think about transparency as well, we would continue to, as you suggested, foster reliance and strengthening of the supply chain, not forgetting communication. At this point in time, I'd like to finally address the panel, and thanks to Dr. Barbosa, Mr. Andreas from the World Bank, all the persons who were a part of our August panelists, and all those who have joined us online for this session. Today, we will now go forward collectively as a region with our harmonizing efforts, wholly and solely to ensure the medical products that are responsive to not only the COVID-19, but all medical products are safe, efficacious, with readily and be readily accessible by all in our region. And the medical devices as well that are used to diagnose testing, etc. They are sensitive and specific. And we as a region will continue to be very noble in our efforts to response to the COVID-19 pandemic and in preparation for the next pandemic. Thank you all for joining us, and I now hand over the program to the Pandra Secretariat. Thank you all again.
Saludos y gracias, Marlon. Muchas gracias por presidir esta sesión.
Thank you, Marlon, for presiding over this session. I thank the panelists, especially the moderators and our moderators who have moderated this third session. Now we're going to have a 1 minute active interval in which we will take a look at who was listening in using our Slido.com survey. Now,
continuing here. Okay, if you have access to a cell phone or smartphone, you can point your camera to the QR code and you can answer the questions of our poll. There are 4 questions. And now we can see, you can see them in real time. In which country are you currently? In what type of institution do you currently work? We can see that there is a growing number of people that are answering to our poll, and most of them are representatives of national regulatory authorities and pharmaceutical industry as well. A lot of people have participated in the last conference, which was in El Salvador in 2018. And a lot of people on the audience, although we have made 9 conferences of the they have participated in the last 3. Again, our board, where people are currently, in which country people are located. We have a representation here in the region, especially in the Central America region.
O questionário vai continuar ativo durante
And the questionnaire will be active during our next session. So if me and Murilo are sending you the link, if you have answered through the link, you don't have to answer it again. And at the end of the session, we'll gather this information from the last 2 sessions. And so we can see what our audience is. And I'm going to give the floor to José Luis.
Vamos a seguir entonces, tras nuevamente.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. Once again, we thank our panelists and our chairs and moderators. What we have coming in the next segment of the meeting is an information session on the draft resolution, policy to strengthen national regulatory systems for medicines and other health technologies. So this is just the beginning of a discussion. So we're going to have a dialogue and talk about how we expect this process to go. So we will now give the floor to Leila Sofia Wawa, who is the coordinator of international cooperation at Anvisa, who is going to be making the presentation at this information session. Leila, you have the floor.
Obrigada. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this informative session about the new resolution called Politics to Strengthen the National Regulatory Systems and Other Health Technologies, and about the consultation process involved. This proposal was approved by the Executive Committee and will be discussed next year to have a consensus between the members. And I'm going to give the floor directly to Dr. Maria Luiz Pombo. She is the consultant for vaccines in PAHO. To present the theme, Dr. Maria Luz, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Laila, and it is a pleasure to be with all of you here today to present the document and resolution on the policy, as was just described by Laila. Policy to strengthen national regulatory systems for medicines and other health technologies, which will be presented formally at the meeting of the Executive Committee of PAHO next year and at the Pan American Sanitary Conference of 2022. Many issues have come up over this 3-day meeting, which highlight progress made in the evolution of the regulatory systems in the region of the Americas over the last 10 years, since the 2010 adoption of the resolution known as CD50R9 on strengthening of national regulatory authorities for medicines and other health technologies. We looked at all of this progress on Monday and Wednesday, and also heard from our assistant director this morning during plenary session 3. While a lot of progress has been made, there are still challenges, which are a permanent aspect of building efficient and integrated health regulatory systems. We know that some of these achievements are thanks to national policies, and such policies that include elements of sustainability and efficiency to strengthen or to facilitate the strengthening of national regulatory systems. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the challenges in terms of the capacity and governance of regulatory authorities in the system, and there's a renewed interest by the member states to have innovation in the production and approval of health technologies and medicines to lower barriers to access to new medicines and health technologies within health systems. In addition, there are challenges that were mentioned over the course of the session on Wednesday in terms of the pandemic response. And the new regional context, which was mentioned by the Assistant Director in his opening remarks this morning, along with the adoption in 2019 of the global benchmarking tool, which is different from that which was applied during the previous decade by PAHO in the region of the Americas. It's a new qualification system for authorities based on maturity level, and it also contemplates additional exercises to assess this capacity within regulatory systems that are on the list of globally recognized regulatory authorities under the WHO or WLAs in WHO lingo, and this includes a commission to a transmission of the regulatory authorities that are now known as authorities of regional reference to get them recognized internationally. With all of this, and as has been announced throughout this conference, the Pan American Health Organization, within its directing council, I meant to say within the Executive Committee meeting of 2021, received instructions to include the adoption of a policy aligned with the current context within the provisions planned for the 2022 directing Pan American Sanitary Conference. We'd like to highlight some of the concepts included in the draft resolution within this forum that includes the participation of all of the regulatory authorities of the region of the Americas. First of all, in the region, we continue to have asymmetries, and many of the member states have not yet prioritized the strengthening of their regulatory authorities. The COVID-19 pandemic has also made apparent some shortcomings that require an investment in terms of resources and a renovation or a renewal of a political commitment to this. Secondly, we would like to point out and reiterate the results of the recent decade that show that that the region has adopted a successful model to enhance regulatory capacity, and therefore we expect the draft resolution to highlight that model, which, as you can see in the slide, includes the identification of gaps, strengthens, and the establishment of institutional development plans, the promotion of cooperation amongst NRAs, and networking for regulatory convergence. These are proposed to be the fundamental elements to ensure that this progress can be made. Third, we also need to point out the need for improvements and to promote new approaches that are being applied sub-regionally and multinationally in our region, such as the Caribbean regulatory system and the joint evaluations in Central America for products sold in those markets, in which they seek to have regulatory efficiencies in addition to having a structure that can be used for the specific context to develop the functions that are particularly needed in those settings. Number 4, and this is not necessarily the sequence that the document needs to have, but we also propose including recognition of a benchmarking of regulatory systems so that these results have the appropriate implications both regionally and globally. And also, given the various health technologies that require supervision by regulatory entities, and since the 2010 resolution did not reflect the specific needs in terms of challenges posed by other technologies such as medical devices, advanced cellular therapies, combined technologies, and other personalized medical products, this resolution proposes some clear guidance regarding what is expected of regulatory systems in this regard. Finally, policies to increase the production of essential health technologies and medicines will acknowledge immunization as a public good, as our Assistant Director stated. And this requires a renewed view or new view of the regulatory systems as part of the secret to success and working relationships with other sectors that have a role to play in the health systems nationally. Within the proposed lines of action of this policy are, first of all, 4 general elements. First, to adopt state policies that are sustainable and sustained over time to strengthen the governance and leadership of regulatory systems with the renewed commitment to the principles that we have mentioned throughout this conference and which have been adopted at other conferences within the PANDRA, such as technical regulatory independence, transparency, risk management, and accountability by the regulatory systems. Second, promoting strategies to strengthen regulatory systems that include the real situation of health systems, national markets for medicines and other health technologies that come into the health system in response to specific needs. The advantage of collaborative approaches and reliance as part of the benefit risk criteria to be considered when regulatory decisions are made, and also the specifics of national policies on access to medical products and fostering local development should also be considered in light of each country's specific situation. Next, promote the adaptation of current benchmarking systems of the regulatory authorities and their international recognition as an integral part of the strengthening processes. And finally, strengthening everything regarding the convergence of regulatory systems at the regional level through intersectoral and regional cooperation. Timeline and next steps. What we'd like to share with all of you today are the most important elements, as Leila said at the beginning of her remarks. In September of this year, the Executive Committee of the Pan American Health Organization included this policy to strengthen national regulatory systems within the agenda of governing bodies for 2022. Between February and March of 2022, we plan to have consultations with member states in order to arrive at a consolidated text that includes all items of interest to the regulatory authorities of the member states, and which are they communicate to PAHO and the governing bodies. Then in June of 2022, during the meeting of the Executive Committee, in which there is participation of some of the member states, and you can see who the members are. You can see that on screen. They will invite the Executive Committee to look at that policy and adopt the proposed resolution and to recommend that it be adopted at the 30th Pan American Sanitary Conference, which will be held the week of September 19 to 23 of 2022. So with this presentation, I have summarized what you can find in this policy document and in the resolution. And I thank you for your attention and invite you to participate actively in the upcoming sessions and the consultation processes that we will be organizing with each of the member states. I now give the floor back to the moderators of today's session.
Muchas gracias, Mariluz. Perdón, Laila.
Thank you very much, Mariluz. I'm sorry, Laila, I see you have the floor.
Thank you. Not just to thank Dr. Maria Luz for her presentation, but the initiative to consolidate in a participatory way the knowledge and all the experiences that were acquired are very welcome. And we hope that we can effectively strengthen the work of the regulatory agencies in the region. I will give the floor to Dr. Anali Rojas, Chief of the Drugs and Health Technology of PAHO, to lead the discussion of the new proposition. Dr. Analia.
Thank you, Laila, and it is a pleasure to be with you again during this last session of this 10th PANDRA conference. And I thank you, Maria Luz, for the presentation of this process, as is true of all resolutions that will be considered by our ministers of health at the conference. This will be preceded by a consultation process. The chat, somebody asked whether this is only going to be with the member states. I'm sorry about the background noise. That's the problem of being in a neighborhood of Argentina trying to make this kind of presentation. But before I share some considerations with you, I invite you to either put your questions or suggestions in the chat box. But please bear in mind that this process is going to be carried out formally through a process with the member states. This is an obligation that PAHO has to inform the member states and consult with them. But without a date, non-member states and other important actors, and particularly those who are involved or formally have formal relations with PAHO can submit comments and suggestions. However, we generally do not go through a formal consultation with non-state parties, but with Alifar and FIFARMA, you know that we do tend to have informal consultation and presentations with you, since that is not part of the rules of our governing bodies. Beyond this, this conference that has been shortened and concentrates on our how we've been conducting evaluations since 2010, and also in light of COVID-19, as we're trying to look to the future, has had some very important inputs. We've heard interest on behalf of countries to strengthen reliance and to strengthen international cooperation and to build trust. And there's a question in the chat about any initiatives PAHO has to foster reliance. PAHO, as the Secretariat of PANDRA, supported and presented at the previous session of the conference some solid principles for regulatory reliance, and this is the foundation for fostering these mechanisms. In addition, it has had an international impact, and we use these mechanisms for those countries that procure products through the revolving fund and the strategic fund for the procurement of medicines, and most countries have tools to facilitate this. But I would like to invite the participants to ask questions or share any comments about the resolution. So if you could help me, Fernanda, even though I don't, let me know anything that I might miss in the chat, or if there are any specific comments on the resolution.
Sí, te aviso, Mariluz. Por ahora, la única pregunta ya fue contestada.
Okay.
For now, the only question was answered.
Mariluz y yo trabajamos muy juntas.
I'm sorry, I meant to say Analia. Yes, excuse me. It's that Mariluz and I work very closely together. So, meanwhile, since apparently there are no concerns people need to raise, I'm going to particularly ask our regulatory authorities that are present now to please actively communicate with your ministries of health on this topic, because you know that formally the representative to the Pan American Health Organization is the Ministry of Health and the health authorities. And invitations to the consultation process take place through the ministry. We know that amidst these considerations, sometimes that communication is delayed or it gets lost in bureaucratic red tape. So we want to say once again, please pay attention to these calls for consultation and try to work starting now, thinking about the elements that countries need to have included in this new policy, not only to build on our progress since 2010, which is quite a bit, but to continue to make progress over the next 10 years. I wish to stress that despite this format, and perhaps this can conclude the comment segment of our conference, and despite the fact that this 10th conference was shortened, and I have some colleagues that believe very much in the evidence that's been put together over the last 10 years. I wasn't present for the first PANDRA conferences, but first of all, I think that they didn't draw as large a number of participants as what we have in this virtual format, and they did not have the capacity to decide to choose amongst panelists from so many different authorities that had so much information to share. The problem we faced as we were putting together this agenda in the Secretariat and suggested this to the steering committee of PANDRA, we were trying to think how we could have an agenda to show all of the virtues that we have in the region. We've had chairs from each of the sub-regions, and we've had chairs from all of the regions, and they've not only played their role with authority and panelists who made contributions with countries from such as Guyana that has a newly created agency, and the new agency of Paraguay, and our colleagues from Central America during the first session with the director of the Panamanian NRA. And we've had representatives of international organizations and donors and development agencies who are aware of and who stressed the contributions and progress made in this region over the last 10 years. And now we have several panelists who not only talk about what they did, but also what they did vis-a-vis their cooperation with another country during one of the worst health crises that the world and our region has lived through in the past 100 years. So it's no coincidence that when we have this virtual format and speak in confidence, go back to what our deputy director was talking about with confidence building, and also what the director said at the opening session with a view to the future. This is something that we have building over 10 years. It's something that was built thanks to the transparency and the call from a group of authorities in Oaxaca, Mexico, called upon PAHO to create a system that would allow authorities to assess each other and create a mechanism for reliance. This cannot be done just spontaneously, but rather it has to be done based on trust, but technical trust, and trust on what my colleague is doing at this regulatory authority in the neighboring country is reliable enough that I don't have to duplicate that work. This takes some time. And we believe that the path set out 10 years ago continues to be the correct one. We need to adapt it to the new context, but the system of evaluation with transparency and trust and working together is at the appropriate level, and I believe that that is what has given us a comparative advantage over the last 10 years compared to other regions of the world that did not use this mechanism. COVID shows us that we still have a lot to do. The pandemic showed us that we need to reassess our productive capacity for essential supplies, but we must do this strategically, not like what we did in 2009. We had this initial enthusiasm to try to produce influenza vaccines, which later waned, but rather with the strategic idea of looking at regional supply chains and complementarity amongst countries, and with the regulatory system and regulatory support from the beginning that was also coordinated amongst the various countries. And finally, as we seek international recognition, understanding our place in the region with all of the work lost, and to recognize all the evaluations done by PAHO with the countries in recognition of this mechanism. But we also acknowledge that there is still a lot to be done. And this isn't done just because we did evaluation once or because we received some recognition that we're happy with just that. Rather, regulation must continue on the path of continuous improvement. I always say that I will never forget the commitment placed before me by a representative of the Caribbean at one of these conferences, the one in Mexico, and they said, well, this system is all fine and good, but what about small countries that have small countries and different regulatory capacity? They're different in terms of their health systems are different, and they don't necessarily need to have a regulatory authority according to that same model. Now we're looking at this thanks to the innovation and creativity of the Caribbean regulatory system. We have countries working together. We do the same in Central America with joint evaluations, and they're moving towards a unified Central American system that is efficient and relies on trust. The progress that we've made is thanks to the joint effort of countries and their commitment to transparency. I invite industry to support that effort at transparency and to continue to work with us as our partners have been doing. So without further ado, we can close this PANDRA conference, and we will hope to see you at our next conference. I hope that we can be together drinking coffee and on our breaks and can continue to work together to improve the Pan-American regulatory system that we are so proud of today. On behalf of Pajo and my colleagues, I particularly thank my colleagues and the team that have made this tremendous effort to put together and organize this conference. I thank all of the panelists and authorities who have made us feel that despite the difference, this conference was once again a success. Thank you, everyone.